Greetings. In this video, I'd like to address law, sexuality, and society, with, of course, a focus and emphasis on social control. I'll start by pointing out that there are so many different areas to cover that if you look at the newspaper or the news any day, you would probably see several examples. One example that I usually start with is that in one community, a store was selling statues of Michelangelo's David, and community members complained that it was inappropriate, so they put a scarf around his waist. And some might argue that that was indeed the right thing to do, and others would argue that that was a little overboard. And so you begin to see a lot of debates occur. This is especially apparent when we get into the area of paraphilias. And a paraphilia is basically an unusual sexual behavior. And one of the interesting features of paraphilias is that they may be legal or illegal depending on a variety of factors such as location, age, the actual act, and they may or may not be considered to be mental disorders. And we'll address that later on when we get into the section on medical social control. Culture also has a lot to do with how we view sexuality as a society, and the rules, regulations, and laws and social control mechanisms. One example that Berga and colleagues reported in 2010 in their article in the Journal of Sex Research, Paraphilias Across Cultures, Contexts, and Controversies, is that, for example, they use the example that homosexuality was considered a mental illness in some cultures, and still is. In others, it is not. And in the United States, it was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1973. We can also look at what is tolerated in different cultures, the actual legal codes and how they're applied, how religion is integrated into these decisions and laws, as well as the differences that exist within and between cultures and over time. And then Berga and colleagues talk about using Gagnon and Simon's scripting theory to try to understand how sexuality is scripted and embedded within societies, and looking at the who, what, when, where, why, and how, asking those questions. And of course, we could also apply those as to how the particular behavior is to social control. A case study I have here is, I guess, topless dancing or stripping. And it's an interesting feature because there's a whole history in the Central Florida area that one could easily write a book and call it Stripping in Central Florida, a historical analysis with an emphasis on social control. 1920 to 2016. What's interesting is that you have some examples. If you live in the Central Florida region, you have certain examples, but if you live in other areas, you may have other examples as well. For example, when I lived in Connecticut, my understanding was at the time that these topless bars were not allowed. It would be illegal, and so you just didn't have them in the state. And you can see that there was once a club called Club Wana, and on their front door they have, "If total nudity offends you, do not enter." Club Wana, the management. Interestingly, that was a club in Fern Park, Florida, which was demolished to make way for a highway crossover that took out that club, as well as two other clubs that were in that area. And then I have other cases. For example, a 1968 topless bar case out of California. The reason I put that one in there is because my father was the hearing officer who heard that case back in 1968. He sometimes took me to hear his cases, hoping that I would become an attorney. And he took me to cases like teacher union disputes, liquor license disputes, pilots, union disputes and everything. But back in the 1960s, I was relatively young, so I never went to the topless bar case. But after he passed away, and I was going through his boxes of papers, I found this 1968 article and thought it was very, very interesting, and also that not much had changed into the current time period. And then there's a case that ended up in Winter Park, Florida, and this involved a strip club called the Booby Trap, which was a building that was supposed to resemble breasts, and I have a picture there of it in the 1970s. It had been around, I think, in the 1970s it was built, and it wasn't until really it was at Orange County, in an unincorporated area, I guess. So it wasn't part of Winter Park until maybe, I don't know, 8 years ago or so. And then when it became part of Winter Park, the city did not approve of that establishment, and there began to be conflict, which led in 2010 to investigations about drug use or sales going on in the club, and harassment lawsuit and other legal issues. By 2015, to update, the city bought the Booby Trap, and they demolished the building. And last time I heard that the property is up for sale now. And so you get the idea, though, of the law, social control, and some of the mechanisms, and the community. Um, and also, I remember the case back to Club Wana, and I have the article, "Bubble Bubble Nude Macbeth, No Trouble," and there was a big debate on whether there was, if topless dancing, I guess, was would be considered, did it have any artistic value? And so, in order to address that, or to claim that topless dancing had, or stripping even, had artistic value, the Club Wana dancers performed Macbeth to indicate that they were doing Shakespeare. And so that was an interesting case indeed. Back in 2001, I'm sorry, that was 1999. Back in 1999, where the strippers performed Macbeth to demonstrate that they were meeting the requirement of artistic value. I mean, Shakespeare, artistic value. Also, there's research on adult entertainment. Some studies found no significant relationship between the adult entertainment nightclubs and crime rates. Others found that the rates were actually lower. But some more recent research has come out that shows the rates were actually higher. So there's mixed results, and I think, to be fair regarding making policy based on research, that one would have to actually study a specific location, because it could be, lower, higher, or similar rates than to the surrounding areas where there were not adult clubs. And the mechanisms are unclear why we might find different findings as well. But I always like to bring in the research there. So that actually, to update that, I would say it's more mixed, and we still need to try to figure out what seems to be going on there. Certainly, I talked to people about the Booby Trap, which had changed names several times. But I was told by some sources that there was a higher crime rate in that particular area, and that was one of the reasons they wanted to purchase it and demolish it. I was told by another person, a couple people actually, that were involved in city politics that they considered it to be an eyesore and didn't want that to be the entryway into their city. So there's lots of debates. Of course, what I would want to know. In a couple of years, we'd actually be able to look to see if crime declined since it was demolished. But I think it's too soon to really answer that since it was just demolished last year. There's also a lot of debate and social control issues regarding prostitution. Also pornography. How do we know if it's legal or illegal? And is there a fine line between what's pornographic and what's not pornographic? And of course, how has technology impacted the debate? And can pornography be harmful? Probably we should say, under what conditions is pornography harmful? And under what conditions is it not? Another interesting case, years ago, I went to Disney with some colleagues from my sociology graduate program at University of Connecticut. Went through the Pirates of the Caribbean, and when we came out of the ride, one of my colleagues said that they couldn't believe the violence toward women scene, that they were quite surprised to see that Disney would promote violence toward women. I didn't see it at all. So I said, okay, I got my camera. Let's go back on the ride again. Fortunately, there weren't long lines. We just went through the line again, and I took a picture of this scene where these women are tied up with ropes and they're being taken away by pirates. And there's a lot of debate about that. And I would use that in my introductory courses and kind of describe it, but not say what it was. And people would say, you can't have that on your yard as a decoration. That would be obscene. That would be illegal. That would be, promotion of violence toward women and so on. But then when I told them it was the Pirates of the Caribbean, students actually got angry and argued that I had taken it out of context, that I was, playing around with like a game, to try to get them to say it. And so I let it go. And then I find back in 1997, an article, Disneyland tones down pirates' lusty ways, from the Associated Press. And my understanding was that they also removed that scene, I think, at the local one in Orlando. At least that's what I heard. Again, when we think about pornography and technology, and there's a whole history behind that. And the standards are interesting. The Miller versus California 1973 case, the three standards to determine what is obscene and pornographic are whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, I guess that means appeals to the sexual interest causing a person to become sexually aroused, and whether the work or communication depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. And third, whether the work of communication taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I think that was the last one that the Club Wana dancers used in their debate. It's obviously, those are very subjective definitions, and so it's difficult to determine what are community standards. One way around that is to do a random select survey of community members, and again, thinking about prurient interest, that's a difficult area to research there. And then is it depicted in a way that is patently offensive with sexual conduct specifically defined by the state law? That gets very difficult to determine. And whether the work is artistic or literary or political, that I'm totally lost there. I don't know. It's extremely difficult to determine what would be considered pornographic and obscene in many cases. And there's different views on what would be that are often researched and discussed. I present some of the research on the attempts to differentiate pornography from erotica, or violent versus nonviolent pornography, and really some of the research pointing out that it's the violence and sexuality merge that seems to be problematic, or violence alone. And there used to be this big debate that when back in the VCR days, people could go to the VCR rental stores and they could go through the double doors, which was the adult section, and get these X-rated videos, and those were for adults only. But people argued that the real dangers were the slasher films that teenagers were watching, that were in the adventure, mystery, fantasy sections in the regular part of the store. Certainly there's risks to adolescents who view pornography. And with adults, it seems to be more related to the actual personality characteristics and socialization of the individual. So for many, it appears the research shows that pornography doesn't appear to be a problem, but for some with certain characteristics or in a certain situation, it does. And of course, we can ask: is technology going to how does technology change that in the variety of ways? And then I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about sexting, which really started, according to Chafflin, who published an article in 2009. It's only a picture, sexting, smutty snapshots, and felony charges in visual studies. It started around 2005. It looks like a very large proportion of adolescents have either sexted or received nude pictures. And the big question really here would be the legal issues. And for example, if you found a study that showed that a third of high school students in a particular location had engaged somehow in sexting, whether sending or receiving or distributing, basically, if you were going to follow the law as it applies today, each of those individuals could be charged with child pornography. And so, obviously, we don't want to arrest 1/3 of high school. So we run into those issues, and probably more education would be relevant here, as well as counseling. And we've also seen some, terrible situations where um, uh, adult hackers got teenagers to send them nude pictures and then threaten them and got more. And then the result in a couple of these cases is the adolescent victim committed suicide. So we have to look at, and how does that relate to the legal aspects? So certainly there are many negative consequences for sexting, including regret, embarrassment, reputation harm, family problems, but also arrest and prosecution, and the possibility of being labeled as a sex offender. So, of course, the big debate now is what should we do in regards to sexting from a criminal justice, a legal, as well as a mental health perspective. And those debates are still being explored. And of course, all of this relates to social control. And this wraps up this video.